Welcome to State of the State. I'm John Carlevale, and our guest for today is Ken Block, and he's going to be talking to us about his new book, Disproven. And if you're not aware of what this book is about, it's about the research that Ken has done and completed for the Trump campaign to determine whether or not there was any degree of fraud to substantiate the many claims that it was a fraudulent election. Welcome to State of the State once again, Ken.
It's been a few years, but I am thrilled to be back.
Well, we're thrilled to have you, Ken. And you're going to be talking about some things that I find particularly interesting, and I hope that our audience will. And I think when they listen to your view of what you did and how you did it, they'll find that interesting as well, but more importantly, informative. And you have some ideas about how the system of voting needs to be improved, not just here in Rhode Island, but throughout the nation.
Yes.
So, Ken, I'm going to ask you to start from the very beginning. How did you come to be working for the Trump campaign?
It was a phone call out of the blue the day after the election. One of the top campaign attorneys for the campaign itself called me on my cell phone. I don't know how he figured out how to reach me. And he asked very directly if I would help the campaign look for evidence of voter fraud sufficient to change the outcome of the election in any of the states that we all know by heart: Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. I told him I'd have to think about it, and I talked to my wife and daughter after the fact. And as I thought about it, I realized that this represented a truly unique opportunity to audit a national election, a presidential election, with virtually unlimited resources in terms of money and also data. And I knew that I could do the job even-handedly, whereas a great many people would be delivering results that were custom ordered. And when I called Alex Cannon back, Alex is the lawyer who called me, and we talked about whether or not I would do it, I made clear that two things: that I didn't think we would find what I knew the campaign needed to be found, because in a decade of looking at voter data, I hadn't seen anything close. But more importantly, that if it was there, I would find it. But if it wasn't there, it wasn't there.
It wasn't there.
And he said, I get it. I appreciate your honesty. We want an honest evaluation of whether or not there is fraud. And that's exactly what we're looking for. We want a straight-up assessment. Let's go.
And Ken, if that's what they were looking for, they asked the right man.
They did. And I know that's what they wanted. Now, that's surprising because we keep hearing about Trump attorneys who couldn't care less about the factuality of the information that they were bringing forward. The two camps of lawyers didn't get along at all. The lawyers I reported to very much didn't get along with lawyers like Rudy Giuliani and the others that we also know by heart. I wasn't aware how bitterly they were opposed to each other until well after I was done with all my work, and I read about it during the as I was researching the book. I learned a lot about the behind-the-scenes activities by reading the depositions from the January 6th Commission.
Well, at that time, that was really the first time that your work had been made available for the public view.
Yes, but nobody knew. So even though Cannon was subpoenaed by the January 6th Commission, he gave a deposition, he gave several depositions. His only televised appearance was a minute where he said that he took the campaign's findings of no voter fraud sufficient to change an election result to Trump's chief of staff at the time, who was Mark Meadows, told Mark Meadows there was no evidence of voter fraud, And Meadows' response to that was, that means there's no there, meaning that the claims of voter fraud didn't have any substantiating information behind them. And we also learned after the fact that Meadows took that information into the Oval Office.
Wow. And so you would think that the story ends there, but it really doesn't, Ken.
It really doesn't.
Because this book really demonstrates to whoever might be interested in what's in here, how it's done, the things that you experienced, the challenges that you had to work around, and some things that you simply couldn't do because they're perhaps not doable at this time. So Ken, you know, it's an interesting thing. After we talk about what we just talked about, what's the first thought that comes to your mind that you want to share with our viewers?
Yeah, so there's really three distinct parts of the book, and
Yes.
each part of the book is written with a purpose. I would say that overall, my point in writing the book was to make sure that the story was told the way I experienced it. I didn't want somebody else framing what I did. That's why I'm happy the January 6th Commission didn't subpoena me. That's why I'm happy that I've got the book written before any of my materials, which were subpoenaed by Jack Smith and his investigation in D.C., and Fonnie Willis and her investigation in Georgia. I wanted to tell the factual story about what we did, what we looked at, why so many claims of voter fraud, in fact, why every single claim of voter fraud that I was asked to evaluate that others brought to the campaign's attention were wrong. They were false. It's really important to talk about that from a factual, here it is, black and white, this is what happened, this is why these things never went to court, and here's why everything that did go to court was tossed out, right? I mean, there were reasons for all of that.
Yes.
Secondarily to that, it's really important to understand what actually caused Trump's loss in 2020. There is absolutely a way to be 100% sure about what happened, why it happened, and I provide the readers three different expert opinions that all arrive at the same answer, one of whom was Trump's pollster. So yeah, there's all that piece of it. And then the piece that I care the most about, I mean, I'm so tired of relitigating the 2020 election.
Yes.
Great many people are tired of relitigating the 2020 election. But the important part of this book, and I use the work for Trump as the hook, and really what I want everyone to read is the back part of the book, which is here's what's wrong with how we conduct our elections, and here's what we can do to make them better. So those are the three pieces. What I would say in terms of the front of the book is that there truly, truly isn't any evidence whatsoever that the election was stolen. Not evidence that's credible. And I guess that's a big distinction.
It is a big distinction,
Yeah.
Ken. And it's an important distinction. What really got my interest, actually everything in this book got my interest, but one of the things that got my interest is that it's not easy to do this kind of research to determine whether an election has been somehow played with and the results have been changed to someone else's advantage. You ran into some things that you probably expected, yet on the other hand, some of them were new to you. Can you talk a little bit about why, in a sense, this is not an easy task to do?
Well, I think the first question you have to ask yourself is, has anybody ever done this before? And I'm pretty sure the answer is no. I don't think anybody has undertaken an effort to audit the results of a presidential election nationwide within what amounts to a very tiny window in which you can contest an election result. And I think that's one of the big surprises to me. I didn't realize going into this that we only had about 35 days. From a legal perspective, you have from the day after the election to the day each state certifies its results. That's your window to contest the election legally. Once the state certifies the results, It's over. Now, you can't tell that based on the mountain of lawsuits that were launched after the results were certified, but all of those legal gambits were doomed to fail because when the state certifies, that's it. Nothing is going to overturn it. Nothing Mike Lindell says is going to reinstate Trump. It's all hyperbole and it's all political theater. None of it would actually ever work in court. And I think most people don't understand that. I didn't know that. So right away, you're up against it. You have 35 days to sift through tens and tens and tens of millions of ballots.
And even if you knew about that and you started as soon as you possibly could, I got the impression that the material, the facts that you need to prove or disprove an idea isn't easy to come by.
It isn't. If I didn't have the full resources of the Republican National Committee available to me, their data gathering expertise, their gigantic database of information flowing in from the election, that's the only thing that made it remotely possible to do what I did. And there were limits to how much we could do. We looked at every single mail ballot cast in the swing states, tens of millions of mail ballots cast, to determine how many of those mail ballots were cast by dead voters. And the numbers were tiny, less than a dozen in any given swing state. We looked for duplicate votes cast by mail ballot voters in the swing states and then also in some other state. We looked as best as we can. We couldn't put together a full national picture. There just wasn't the time to do it. But we found hundreds of duplicate votes. We didn't even find thousands, and that was across all the swing states, let alone enough to find one swing state. Bear in mind that you had to find at least 10,000 votes, 11,000 votes, to be outside the margin of victory in states like Nevada and Arizona. You needed more than, but you needed 12,000 votes in Georgia. You needed 90,000 votes in Pennsylvania, and you needed 150,000 votes in Michigan. Michigan really wasn't a swing state. It was being contested because Trump barely won it in 2016, literally I think by 10 or 11,000 votes. But he lost by 150,000 votes in 2020. So what's behind all of that, right? And I know you're still asking about the data challenges.
Yes, I am.
And they were manifest. To properly have contested the election, you can't start the day after the election. You have to start literally months in advance. That wasn't done in this circumstance. No prep work had been done, and we were reactive across the board, and that was to do what I was contracted to do, let alone addressing the claims of fraud that came in from literally everywhere that the campaign was asked to assess for the validity of the claims. And now this is also a really interesting and important part of what I did. We didn't consider this in my contract, but the campaign had a lot of confidence and trust in what I was doing for them and my transparency and our thoroughness. And the day after we signed the contract, I was asked to assess a claim if 100 dead voters, as reported by a funeral home owner in Pennsylvania, were in fact voting from the grave. And the answer was no. All of them did not vote from the grave. None of them voted from the grave. I was asked to assess a claim made by John Eastman that 16,000 votes cast in Nevada were duplicate and therefore fraudulent votes. And I knew before I even looked at it that it was wrong. And I said it was probably 160 instead of 16,000, and the actual number of duplicate votes turned out to be 16.
16.
So, yeah, right, so we fended off some really bad data analytics. And the most entertaining one for those who are watching was a claim in Wisconsin that more than 700,000 voters in Wisconsin committed voter fraud. And this was a remarkable finding. And the people who conducted the investigation didn't understand what they were looking at, which is a common theme across all of these claims. They made a mistake, a critical mistake in understanding what they were looking at, incorrectly determined that 700,000 duplicate illegal votes were cast in Wisconsin, got excited, wanted the feds to come in, brought that finding to a friend of theirs who played golf, who brought the finding to the manager of a Trump golf course, who brought the finding to Eric Trump, who delivered it to the lawyer I reported to, who gave it to me, who said, tell me why this is wrong. And it wasn't hard.
Well, one of the things that I was impressed with is that you've done something extremely well that is not easy to do. You ran up against some very difficult things. Not all the states have the data available in the way that you can use it. Some of them don't keep the data like we think they should keep. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm gonna back into that conversation.
Okay.
And one of the big challenges we have as a country as we conduct our elections is that we don't have one set of election infrastructure. In fact, we don't have 50 sets of election infrastructure. If every state had its own election system, that would be a real improvement over what we really have.
Indeed.
We have more than 5,000 different election jurisdictions in this country, many of whom, and a lot of that's county governments, and many of these counties have their own election infrastructure that's different from all the other counties in the same state, and they tend to do things differently, and not just computer stuff. They oftentimes implement their elections differently from a process standpoint. And you really see that with how mail ballots are handled across the country. One of the things I tried to do in the book, and the whole focus of what I did for the Trump campaign, was struggling with and trying to analyze mail ballot data from across the country. And to do that comprehensively would involve processing more than 500 different files from all over the counties all over the country, all with different data in it, all done differently. It means different things, and it was impossible to look at all of them in the tiny window that we had. So we had to squeeze it down and really focus in on the swing states in particular, and then really large states where at least there was one data file and we didn't have to deal, in the case of New York, with 62 different data files. And even Nevada, which is not a large state, has 17 different data files, all done differently. It was a monumental challenge, a shock, because when you process election data after the election, each state has one file. But it doesn't look like that the day after the election. It's really different. It's really challenging. That's one of the reasons you need to start working on it months in advance so you can be ready for the whole thing. And these differences in how states conduct their elections yield shocking problems with how our elections get conducted. And I'm transitioning here. I don't know if you're okay with sliding over a little bit.
But I just want to comment and ask you this. When I read this, I said, gee, what a struggle for anyone to, how is this even possible? Well, I thought that if anyone can do it, it's Ken Block, but I couldn't imagine that even in one state, the counties have different ways of managing, and that thought never occurred to me, because I think in Rhode Island, and I may be wrong on this, we're pretty consistent throughout our...
One system, one file.
Yeah, one system.
All done the same.
Yep.
Not so in most of the places.
Not so, and so on. And that really, took me by surprise. And I would say to our viewers, Ken, that this is not only a good read, it's an educational experience if you are interested in how our elections are conducted and some of the huge problems that exist. So Ken, you pick up where you left off and go where you need to go.
Sure. And what I just want to say to the viewers that are here is that it's not a dry read. It's an interesting read. It's not all tech talk. It really was written in a way to allow non-technical people to have a feel for what's happening without dragging you through all kinds of numbers. And I wanted to make this accessible because the information that's in here and the explanations that come forward are just so important for everybody to understand, to put their head around what really went on and the reason so many court cases didn't work and everything else, that I took great care, and the editors who worked on the book took great care to ensure that your eyes won't glaze over while you read it. I assure you, in the most circumstances, that they won't.
Well, and I agree, Ken. And one of the things that you did artfully is that you kept the chapters short.
Yeah.
And so it was an easy read in that way, of course, but in so many other different ways. And the kinds of things that you're talking about, Ken, are important because, and I don't want to jump ahead of your thinking, so if I do, you forgive me and you go where you believe it's best to go. But your experience really gives to us a very important view about what we need to do, not just in one state, the state that we live in, but throughout the country. Is that an accurate interpretation?
It is, and it comes down to revisiting the idea or the fact that we have 5,000 plus different election jurisdictions in this country. And what I'd love to do to sort of highlight the nature of the problem that we have is discussing what happens to the vote that was cast early by a voter who votes by mail 3 weeks before the election and then has the misfortune of passing away before Election Day. Does the vote count or does the vote not count? And the answer is shocking. The answer is it depends on where that person lived. In some states, the vote counts by law. In other states, the vote specifically doesn't count by law. And in a third of the states, there's no law. And Rhode Island is one of the states where there's no law. Now, Rhode Island counts the vote, but there's no basis in law for that decision to be made. It's actually a surprising situation. And in Michigan, a state that disallows the vote, more than 3,500 votes of voters who voted early but died before the election were not counted because the state was able to determine that the voter had died before Election Day. So it's not a small issue. But for me, principled, the really big problem here is that there's no way that the voter's experience should be that dramatically different that whether or not the vote counts is even up in the air and a question. It should count everywhere or it shouldn't count everywhere. You can't have this situation where maybe it does and maybe it doesn't. And that same problem that I just laid out with this one example is everywhere with how we conduct our elections. It's shocking how differently different election jurisdictions handle mail ballots.
Indeed.
Right? I mean, stunningly surprising how bad it is in some places, how good it is in other places, how hard it is to figure out what the heck is happening at all based on the data that they provide. And some states do a great job maintaining their voter rolls, and some states have the most awful problems with their voter data that you can imagine. And it's just inconsistency that yields a really an uneven playing field, uneven voter experiences, and ultimately, I believe it's a lot of unfairnesses in our election system. And as far as bad data is concerned, my favorite example is the state of New Jersey. It's not the worst of the worst, but they have a pretty shockingly bad problem. They have 25,000 registered voters with a year of birth of 1800. And in 2020, 8,000 of those voters with a year of birth of 1800 voted. Now, that's not voter fraud. That is sloppy computer systems and election workers not backfilling missing dates of birth. Some of that might be voter fraud, but it's not proof of voter fraud. New York State has an even worse problem. It's in the millions of people. But again, sloppy computers, old computers, 62 different computer systems that don't cooperate well with each other, right? These are, I mean, New York State has 1.2 million voters on the rolls who've been registered at least 20 years who haven't voted in at least 20 years.
Wow.
They're dormant voters. With those voters off the rolls, turnout in New York State jumps from 70% in 2020 to 78%, right? It's a big problem. And New York has they're the worst data in the whole country. By far, of the 42 states data I've been able to look at, they have the worst data. So you have all of that. You have gerrymandering, one of my favorite topics. And some states gerrymander, a lot of states gerrymander, a few states don't. And there is no more unbalancing thing that happens in our elections than the tilting of the playing field for an election by partisan elected officials to create a map that favors one party over the other. And it's not on its face illegal, and I can't put my head around that.
I can't either, Ken.
And I love to talk about democracy in Russia, right? Democracy in Russia consists of Vladimir Putin running against whoever's going to run against him, and if Putin feels at all threatens, he kills his opponent, right? He tips the election by killing his opponent. In the United States, we have candidates who are murdered by maps.
Indeed.
80% of congressional seats are not competitive. It's a shocking statistic.
Yeah. Thanks to the process of gerrymandering.
Thanks to gerrymandering.
And if I don't say this properly, Ken, please correct, but the folks that are in power have the ability to alter the maps of a voting area so that they predominantly get the votes they need to consistently be re-elected or elected. Is that a fair statement?
In states that are Democrat-controlled, you often see gerrymandering to ensure that Democrats win the seats. In states that are Republican-controlled, you see gerrymandering that ensures that Republicans win the race. Doesn't matter who the Republican is, that Republicans win it. And 80% of congressional seats, we know what party is going to sit in that seat regardless of who the candidates are. And that's wrong, because competition is good. Competition is good in the marketplace. Competition is good for incenting innovation. And for sure, competition is good when it comes to politics. Competitive races mean that those who are running have to build a coalition of voters substantial enough to win. So when you have to compete, you must come closer to the middle as opposed to swinging out to the ends. And gerrymandering, I think, is largely to blame for the dysfunction we see in Congress, for the extreme partisanship that we see in Congress right now. And I just can't believe that in our country, where we pride ourselves on democracy, and that it's so unbalanced, and that we allow a mechanism that's more likely to be seen in the third world as opposed to a place like this, where we allow our elections to be unfairly tilted. It's horrible.
Well, Ken, we have just about a minute left, believe it or not. So I'll give you the challenge to end it any way you want, but perhaps we should hear about what ideas you have to fix this or to remedy some of the problems that you've talked about.
There's a lot of things that we can do to fix it, but I think even more importantly than getting to that right now, the voter fraud necessary that stood up in court, and I want to reemphasize, legally speaking, I was contractually obligated to go to court and defend what I found. The problem was we couldn't find anything to defend. And what really happened in 2020 is that Trump lost the moderate Republicans. The rhinos abandoned him, and Trump kind of kicked them out of his orbit. In Georgia, in Arizona, in Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, the margin of victory was the rhinos, who didn't vote. They voted for down-ticket Republicans, but they didn't vote for the top of the ticket. And you see that in Georgia. It's happened in Arizona, it happened in Pennsylvania, it happened in Wisconsin. That was the balance of it. There wasn't a complicated answer for what happened here. It's really simple. And Trump's pollster that he paid millions of dollars to demonstrated that in a different way than I did through data, but came to the exact same result. So we should stay comfortable knowing that massive voter fraud isn't at play. I encourage you to pick up the book. I'm happy to come back and talk about how you fix it, because it's really a much longer.
Let's do that.
It's a much longer conversation than a minute. But there are things that we can do. Unfortunately, we need Congress to step up to make those changes, and who knows how that's going to go.
Ken, we'll do that. Thank you for watching State of the State, and please join us again next time for the next edition of State of the State.